Hello. I would like to welcome all our viewers and our guest speaker, Dr. Afshin Marashi, to the first session of the Iran Colloquium, of the new season of Iran Colloquium that is going to continue throughout 2020 and 2021. This year is the 15th year of our Iran Colloquium. Over that period, we've had probably more than 100 speakers as guest speakers to our Iran Colloquium. We are delighted that we would be able to continue now on a virtual basis rather than face-to-face. There are advantages and disadvantages to that. The advantages is that we're going to have a far larger audience. As I understand today, probably we're going to have about 180 viewers or more. That is very welcome because it removes all the geographical obstacle that we face when we have a face-to-face meeting. The other advantage is that we can have a far broader group of speakers, in this case, throughout this first term until December. We are going to have 5 speakers, 3 of them from the United States and 2 from the UK. That's also very welcome. The disadvantage is that we are not going to be in the same room, and that kind of an interaction that it's very particular to a seminar, face-to-face seminar, is missing. Also, we had a light lunch that no longer is available on the Zoom. But I think all the disadvantages, taking into account, and advantages, I think we are delighted to have this opportunity despite all the restrictions because of the COVID that we are all facing. In addition to the, perhaps because it's the first meeting of the Iran Colloquium, I should point out that in addition to the 5 talks that has been prepared for or organized for this series, we're going to have an extra session on the challenges to contemporary Iranian economy, which is going to be in late October. It appears along the rest of our programs, the rest of our activities in the website of the Yale program in Iranian Studies. I would welcome you, I would encourage you to take a look at. We have, in addition to that, a series of documentaries every month called DocuNights, where some of the latest documentaries about Iran that has been provided for us through a network will be screened, and it's going to be hosted by Dr. Farbod Honarpishe. In the past, we had a very good experience with that. In addition to that, I would like to thank Dr. Farbod Honarpishe, who is our Yarshater postdoctoral fellow at Yale, and he worked on the preparation of the Iran Colloquium this year very diligently. I would like to thank him. I'd like to thank Ms. Marwa Khabour, who is our administrator and worked equally hard for this series to be made available, and also to Dr. Christine Seibert, our program manager, chief program manager. Thank you for all of that. Let me also point out that after the talk by Dr. Marashi, there is to be a time for question and answer. We take the questions in writing through the question and answer option that you have on your screen. And given probably the size of our audience, our viewer, we may not be able to entertain all the questions. There would be limited number of answers to the questions. And I would like to apologize ahead of time for not being able to take all the questions. Now, a few words about our speaker, Dr. Afshin Marashi, who probably is known as a scholar to the field through his publications. He has, as recent as this year, published a book on exile and the nation, the Parsi Community of India, and the making of modern Iran, which is the topic of his today's talk. So this, like many other occasions in the past, is a chance for our speaker to give us an exposure to the topic, to the subject and the content of their publication. It was published by the University of Texas in this year, 2020. And I'm sure, like his previous books, is going to receive, and has already probably received, a lot of positive responses. His earlier publication, Nationalizing Iran, Culture, Power, and the State, 1870 to 1940, published by University of Washington in 2008, is again a known text for anybody who is interested in the history of modern Iran. Certainly to me, it was part of my syllabus and the classes that I offer on modern Iran, as I'm sure this is the case with the others. He has also co-edited publications of volumes of essays on Iranian modernity, produced numerous articles, and has been very active in the field. We would like very much to welcome him. Up to recently, he was also the director of the Iran Center at the University of Oklahoma, where he is the Farzaneh Professor of Modern Iranian History. And he's just informed us that he decided to step down from this year, although he would remain active as a probably prime person in that center. Dr. Marashi, I think the floor is yours, or the screen is yours, if you want.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Amonat. Thank you for the invitation. It really is a pleasure to be with you at Yale today, at least virtually, even though it's not in person. And I do want to thank Farbod for helping to organize all of this, and for Marwa. And I think I should thank Nahid Siamdoust, who I think last year before the pandemic got everything in motion for all of this. But it really is an honor to be here, especially that very nice introduction by Professor Amonat, whose work has been an inspiration and I've studied very closely for many years. So it's wonderful to be able to join the Yale Iran Colloquium. I'm especially happy to be able to share with you some ideas from my recently completed book, and it was just published in June of this year by University of Texas Press. And the book is really the result of about a decade's worth of work. So I'm glad that it's finally out in the world. And I'm going to try to speak for about 40 minutes or so. And my goal is to provide you with an overview of the book. And of course, there's a great deal in the book that I'm not going to be able to talk about in the talk, but I'm hoping to at least try my best to touch on what at least I think are maybe some of the conceptual and empirical highlights of the book, and hopefully encourage you, some of you who haven't seen the book, maybe to read the book as well. So let me start by describing what I think are maybe some of the key ideas that I'd like to emphasize, and then I'll describe the individual chapters as well. And I have some images that I'll be showing along the way as well. In the broadest sense, the book traces the history of the social, cultural, and intellectual exchange that took place between the Zoroastrian Parsi Community of India and the community of modern nationalist Iranian intellectuals in the early 20th century. And as I argue in the book, it was this exchange between the Indian Parsis and the Iranian intellectuals that played an important role in fostering a revival of antiquity in 20th century Iranian culture. And in a broad sense, I think a lot of my research over the years has been focused on this idea of the revival of antiquity in Iranian modernity. and ultimately the role which that played in helping to foster the official nationalism of the Pahlavi monarchy between 1925 and 1979. So the book tries to make a connection between the diaspora nationalism of the Parsis and the official nationalism that took shape inside 20th century Iran. Now, I realize probably many of you are specialists, but I should probably just very briefly, for the sake of context, just indicate that Zoroastrianism was, of course, the pre-Islamic religion of Iran. After the 7th century Islamic conquest, most Iranians gradually converted to Islam. A small minority of Zoroastrians remained inside Iran, and another portion of Iranian Zoroastrians emigrated from Iran and traveled to the subcontinent, and eventually became known in India as the Parsis, by the ethnonym Parsi, named after the Pars or Fars region from where they originally migrated. Contact between Iranians and the Parsis of India diminished over the subsequent centuries. In fact, maybe I can try to show just a couple of quick images that will highlight this, just to give you a little bit of a visual sense. And then I will come back. Here's the book, by the way. So this is the Indian Ocean world that I'm interested in. Of course, the Parsis eventually make their way to Western India, and the sort of the more concentrated areas are in this sort of region in basically Gujarat and Maharashtra, as well as Karachi and other places as well. And this is an image of the Parsi community. Let me actually leave this. I'll come back to this in a moment. Okay. The Parsis nevertheless remained, they retained a sense of their historic displacement from Iran. And to the point that by the 19th century, the Parsis came to see themselves as an exilic or diaspora community that had been separated from their Iranian homeland, their national homeland. In fact, during the British period in India, the Parsis had also become one of the favored and most prosperous communities in British India. And the Parsis, in fact, played an important role in many of the most important industries of the 19th century, including the textile industry, the shipping industry, banking industry, commercial agriculture, and other things. And as a result of all of this, the Parsis really became a prosperous community in India, not only a kind of wealthy industrial class, but also an important Parsi professional middle class as well. So by the time we get to the 19th century, the Parsi community of India had become really part of a commercial system of the global economy. And Bombay had become a hub for a Parsi global trading network that stretched from Bombay throughout the Indian Ocean and beyond. Now, my book, of course, doesn't tell the whole story. It actually only tells a very small part of this history. And I focus on the renewal of engagement between the Parsis and Iranians after this long period of diminished contact during this period of Parsi prosperity. And in fact, the great prosperity that the Parsis had achieved in British India motivated the community to engage in philanthropic work, that would help the now impoverished Zoroastrian co-religionists inside Iran. And there were still, of course, Zoroastrians inside Iran that by the 19th century were very impoverished. And so Parsi philanthropy towards the Zoroastrians of Iran sort of grew out of this context. And it's in this context as well that this new era of contact began. And this is really where the history that I tell in the book begins. Parsi philanthropy began originally in the mid-19th century, but it accelerated by the 1920s and the 1930s. And that's really the period that is the primary focus of my book, is the interwar period, the 1920s and 30s. And so really one of the first key idea that I would emphasize in the book is that what really begins as an effort of religious charity and philanthropy quickly evolves into something else. And it's something that becomes much more significant. You might say something more ambitious, it becomes more of a more comprehensive cultural and intellectual engagement that goes far beyond charity and philanthropy between Parsis and Iranians. And really most of the individual chapters of the book in one way or another touch on that idea. Another key idea that I just want to maybe highlight at the beginning is maybe the historiographic question within Iranian history, which is the question of how we identify the intellectual origins of neoclassicism in modern Iran. And here I'm building on the work of many, including Professor Amanat, as well as Professor Tavakkoli and others, to argue that we really need to break down the historiographic divide between Iranian studies and South Asian studies. And in this case, to help us understand the origins of Iranian neoclassicism. Within Iranian historiography, the usual explanations tend to be to locate the origins of Iranian neoclassicism to the encounter with European Orientalist knowledge. And certainly the study of the ancient Near East, the fields of history, philology, comparative religion, archaeology, all of these were central preoccupations to the field of Oriental studies at European universities in the 19th century. And it still remains commonplace to trace the origins of Iranian neoclassicism to the intellectual influence of these European systems of knowledge. Now, my point isn't to contradict that argument. And in fact, a lot of that is in my first book as well, where I make those connections. But what I'm really interested in trying to do here is to add another layer of complexity to this history, with the goal of trying to, at least in some measure, decentering the historiography of modern Iranian intellectual history to account for a broader range of entanglements of modern Iranian thought with multiple systems of knowledge, in addition to European Orientalism. And I think we can now say, based on not only certainly my work, but the work of others, that there's more to the story of Iranian neoclassicism than simply European influence. And so one of the key ideas of the book is that in order to understand this revival of antiquity in modern Iran, we also need to investigate the Iranian encounter with the Parsis, as well as the broader context of the decline of the Persianate cultural system in the 19th and 20th century. And I think those are the things that we haven't maybe until very recently started to look at more closely. Let me add one more key idea that I'd like to maybe try to highlight. And that's the book's focus on what I try to call the social and material mechanisms that enabled this engagement between Parsis and Iranians. As I detail in the book, in addition to philanthropic motives, the Parsi-Iranian encounter was also greatly facilitated by two critically important new technologies of the era. And the first is steam-powered navigation of the Indian Ocean, and the second was the proliferation of new print technologies. And here I'm building on the work of Niall Green and others to help trace how steam and print as new novel material mechanisms facilitated the circulation of people, books, and ideas within the Indian Ocean world of the early 20th century. And in particular, for this particular case, I traced the publication history and circulation of a new genre of books with neoclassical themes. And these were books published in Bombay by Zoroastrian publishing houses, very often, in fact, I think in all cases, associated with Parsi civic organizations, and books that were intended for export to the growing print marketplace inside Iran. And it was these books from Bombay, as I call them in the book, that were in some cases and very often were distributed inside Iran free of charge. And there was almost a kind of quasi-missionary context in a lot of this. And so there was, what I describe is not a history of the way in which print worked in this context wasn't in the way we usually think of print capitalism. It was what I try to call print philanthropy, which was really maybe as much connected to the history of sort of the missionary efforts as it was to print technology and the marketplace. So the book is not only about ideas as abstractions, but I also try to detail how these ideas were produced and circulated in their social and material form as books. Now, to illustrate some of these ideas, let me select some examples from the 5 chapters of the book to give you a sense not only of the conceptual arguments, but of the empirical ones as well. And all of this comes back to this broad theme of the movement of peoples and books and ideas between Parsis and Iranians during the early 20th century. And here, let me just quickly show you another image. And this is from the first chapter, where I discuss the life and work of Khosrow Shahrokh, who is an important figure in the story and in the history that I tell. Let me just come back to the screen here. Khosrow Shahrokh played a very important role in connecting the Parsi culture of Bombay to Iran's emerging modern culture. He's a well-known figure in modern Iranian political history, in the early 20th century political history. He was an elected member of the Majlis, where he served as the Zoroastrian representative from 1909 until his death in 1940. He was born into an impoverished Iranian Zoroastrian family in 1874 in the town of Kerman. He was, of course, not a Parsi, but he was a member of this small local Zoroastrian community that had remained in Iran. But his life was very much changed by his encounter with the Parsis while he was still very young. In fact, Shahrokh received his early education in Kerman at a primary school that had been built through Parsi charities going back to the 19th century. He later traveled from Kerman to Tehran, where he continued his education through Parsi funded scholarships. And most importantly, in his late teens, he again, with Parsi funded scholarships, managed to travel to Bombay, where he continued his education there. And again, the sort of the ease of travel by this period made something like this relatively easy. And as a result, Shahrokh studied at one of the Parsi schools in Bombay, the Parsi Benevolent School, that was one of the important Parsi established schools there that had been established in 1849. And it was this school that had as its basis a curriculum that was defined by a reformed and modernized Zoroastrianism. And there had been a whole reform movement in 19th century Bombay among the Zoroastrians as well, that Monica Ringer's book really does an excellent job of documenting. And this school really emerged out of that. And most significantly, after completing his studies in Bombay, Shahrokh went on to write 2 very important books. The first was called Ayneh Mazdayasna, which is a book that is structured like a catechism, in which it poses questions about a religion, and it offers very sort of encapsulated answers to the faith. And the second book is the Furuq Mazdayasna, which includes a series of introductory essays about Zoroastrianism, which were written by Shahrokh. In fact, let me just give you another quick image of these books. And here they are. These were both short books. These are not sort of grand treatises on Zoroastrianism. They were short, almost like pamphlets, like a catechism is a very short, easily accessible work. These 2 books were written between 1907 and 1909 and were published with the help of Parsi philanthropists and book publishers in both Tehran and Bombay. They had a significant circulation inside Iran and were, in fact, as I say, often given away free, especially to non-Zoroastrians. Additionally, they were also used as textbooks in the growing number of Iranian Zoroastrian schools. Both books were also published via the lithographic print method and had a relatively large circulation, certainly in the thousands. And these two books are also important because they are early examples of a Parsi-inspired modern Iranian neoclassicism. They were written in Persian and were intended for an audience of readers inside Iran, really as primers on Zoroastrianism, written from a modernist and reformist perspective. The intended audience was both Iranian Zoroastrians who were learning about their own faith in this reformed and modern way, and just as importantly, non-Zoroastrian Iranian readers. And as I say, they were really intended as books for general audiences. Both books produced really a radically new interpretation of Zoroastrianism that tried to dispel what were now considered to be misunderstandings of Zoroastrianism born of prejudice and medieval religious polemics. And I document some of that in the book. Zoroastrianism was defined by Shahrokh as a monotheistic faith that was rooted in an ethical system that was very much compatible with modernity. It was a religion that de-emphasized religious law, priestly authority, and ritual. The themes of ethical monotheism, as well as universalism, pluralism, ecumenism, are also very well pronounced in both of these books. And Shahrokh, like his Parsi teachers in Bombay, was constructing a kind of Zoroastrian Protestantism that was now compatible with normative notions of religion as understood in the early 20th century. For non-Zoroastrian readers inside Iran, these two books also played an important role in encouraging their curiosity about the classical history of Iran and Iran's pre-Islamic faith. Now let me show you one more picture. The next person I should say something about is Deenshot Irani. Who's the subject of chapter 2 of the book. And in some ways, Deenshot Irani's history and his life is very similar to Shahrokh's. Irani was perhaps the most important Bombay-based intermediary between the Parsis and Iranians. He was actually a Parsi. He wasn't an Iranian Zoroastrian. He was from the Indian community of Zoroastrians. He was actually trained as a solicitor, and he was a partner in one of colonial Bombay's leading law firms. So he was very much part of this professional middle class that had developed among the Parsi community of Bombay during the 19th century and early 20th century. In addition to his legal practice, however, Deenshot Irani was also deeply involved in civic and charity work. And among his most important civic accomplishments in Bombay was the establishment of important Parsi organizations, and the most important one of which is the Iran League. And let me show you a picture of that. Here's the Iran League aims and objectives page, and this is their journal, the Iran League Quarterly. Let me stop share. Deenshot Irani's work was central to the work of the Iran League. And as I say, they also published a bilingual Persian-English journal known as the Iran League Quarterly, which circulated widely in Bombay and India, as well as in Iran. It also circulated elsewhere throughout Europe and North America and Asia. It was actually, they say, in many of the places where it was available, and it was actually available in many places in the world. The articles in the Iran League Quarterly include reformist interpretations of Iranian history, including many articles about this renewal of interest in Zoroastrianism among Iranians inside Iran. There's also another large number of articles that is very prominent in the Iran League Quarterly, focusing on Parsi economic investment in Iran and the prospects of expanding economic investment in Iran on the part of Parsi investors. Like Shahrokh, Deenshot Irani was also an intellectual, and he wrote two very important books of his own, again, intended for general audiences. And let me just give you very briefly those to look at. And here they are. The Akhlaq Iran Bastan and the Falsafe Iran Bastan. And both of these books reflect the same Neo-Zoroastrian revivalism that was at the heart of the Parsi-Iranian exchange. The books also reflected a fascination with universalist ideas derived from the then popular Theosophical Society, which is another theme that runs throughout at least a couple of the chapters of the book, as well as Victorian era speculative scientific ideas. For example, there were popular notions during that era claiming that Zoroastrian theology had anticipated many recent scientific discoveries, including elements of Newtonian physics and Darwinian biology. And the book has a little bit to say about that as well. These ideas found their way into Iranian conceptions of Zoroastrianism via these Parsi sources, and helped to further arouse curiosity and interest in Iran's classical heritage. What made these two books important as well was not only their content, but also the manner in which they circulated. And by the 1930s, the number of bookstores in Tehran, modern bookstores, had greatly increased. And these Zoroastrian books that had been published in Bombay found a readership inside Iran this way as well. In fact, the Iran League sponsored both of these books for publication and sponsored their circulation specifically for the Iranian marketplace, if you will. And both books went through multiple editions during this period. Now, let me highlight another key episode in the Parsi-Iranian exchange of the early 20th century. In this case, highlighting the visit to Iran in 1932 by the Iranian poet and Nobel Prize winner Rabindranath Tagore, which is the subject of chapter 3 of the book. And most of you know Tagore, but let me just show you. Here he is. Tagore was, of course, not a Parsi. He was a Reformed Hindu. He wrote in Bengali. He had a wide-ranging, cultural and intellectual interests and curiosities. He is often described as one of the founders of modern India alongside Gandhi. He's known principally for his poetry, and he was, in fact, the first non-European to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913. And in 1932, he was invited to Iran at the invitation of the Iranian government. And significantly, it was the Parsi community of Bombay who first proposed the visit and helped to arrange and manage the visit as a way of furthering building ties between Iran and India and the Parsi community. And in fact, it was Deenshot Irani who was really the instrumental figure in bringing Tagore to Iran. And he proposed and planned Tagore's visit. And in fact, he accompanied Tagore throughout Tagore's visit to Iran. And in fact, let me show you a couple of more images with this. And here's Tagore, here's Deenshot Irani on the right with members of the Iranian Literary Society. There's Muhammad Taqi Bahar. There's a young Ali Dashti, there's Saeed Nafisi and others. I've been able to recognize or identify most of these people. There's still a couple I'm not able to identify, so maybe you can help me if you know, but it's in the book. Tagore was in fact a global celebrity by 1932. And by the time of his trip to Iran, he had spent more than 2 decades traveling the world as a kind of cultural ambassador for his own unique brand of global solidarity. And his trip to Iran in 1932 was among his last trips. And the book goes into more detail about Tagore's time in Iran, but I'll emphasize maybe 3 important points of Tagore's visit to Iran. The first, Tagore's 1932 trip to Iran was itself an example of this larger theme of cultural circulation between Iran and India. Here, the cultural commodity that was being circulated wasn't books, but it was Tagore himself. And in some ways, Tagore conveyed his own cultural capital in that respect, and his ability to travel to Iran was another way of bringing that kind of cultural message to Iran. Second, and let me say something about this message that Tagore brought. The message that Tagore brought to Iran was in some ways the same message that the Parsis were trying to convey during this period, which is that Iran and India were part of a common culture, a common civilization, rooted in a shared classical heritage that included the Sanskrit and the Vedic and the Avestan culture. And during Tagore's trip, he repeatedly makes references to this idea of a shared culture between Iran and India as being rooted in some common source. It was a symbolic message that was intended to include Iranians as part of Tagore's larger kind of pan-Asian cultural universalism. The third point that I'll make about Tagore's trip is that in some ways, Tagore's trip to Iran publicly enacted the idea of return or a kind of negation of exile that was also part of the culture of Parsi and Iranian exchange. Throughout his trip to Iran, Tagore was repeatedly presented to his Iranian audiences as a long-lost ancestor who was returning home after a long exile. And this message was also precisely what the Parsis of India saw as their own relationship to Iran. The Parsi community's rediscovery of Iran was increasingly tied to a longing for return, remigration, and repatriation to Iran. Tagore's trip to Iran symbolically enacted this idea of a Parsi remigration to Iran. Now, let me say something about chapter 4, where I talk about the life and work of Ibrahim Purdue. And let me show you quickly an image there. Here are some more images of Tagore, by the way. And there's Deenshot Irani. Here they are at the Hafeziyeh and in Shiraz. And here's Purdue, a young Ibrahim Purdue. Ibrahim Purdue's life and work represents perhaps the most important component of the intellectual exchange between Iran and the Parsis. Purdue is today acknowledged as one of the pioneering intellectual figures of Iran's 20th century neoclassicism. His major contribution to the intellectual history of Iranian nationalism is clearly his translations of the Zoroastrian religious texts into the New Persian vernacular language. Knowledge of Avestan and Pahlavi had declined inside Iran, and Purdue's translations had the effect of making these Zoroastrian religious texts available to Iranian readers for the first time in a language that they could read and understand. And the chapter in the book details how Purdue came to acquire the knowledge and the skills necessary to produce these translations. And what I argue is that it was Purdue's engagement with the Parsi scholars, as well as activists, reformist priests, and lay intellectuals that produced the groundwork for Purdue's translations. When Purdue is mentioned in Iranian historiography, it's usually mentioned in the context of his engagement with European Orientalist knowledge, and how it was this engagement that served as the basis for his subsequent work. And it's certainly true that Purdue spent considerable time in Berlin, and I discuss this in the book, during the Weimar period. And he had important personal and intellectual relationships with German scholars. But what remains under-acknowledged is this larger trans-regional network of intellectual exchange between Iranians and Parsis that was also central to Ibrahim Purdue's intellectual development. And there are at least two important Parsi connections that I highlight in the book regarding the Purdue's life. And the first is the role played by Madame Kama, and the role that she played in spurring Pur Davud's curiosity about Zoroastrianism. Madame Bikhaji Rostam Kama was an activist. Let me show you her image. In some ways, she's really the principal connection here for Pur Davud. She was a major figure of her time. She was an activist, a civic leader. She was from a wealthy Parsi family. She was actually the daughter-in-law of K.R. Kama, who's probably the most revered Parsi scholar of the Zoroastrian reform movement of the late 19th, early 20th century. And she was also a major figure in India's independence movement. And she was one of the founders of the Free India Society and the Young India Society. And as part of her political work, she was active in building political coalitions between Irish, Egyptian, Turkish, German, Russian, and Iranian activists and intellectuals. And it was in this context that Madame Kama met Ibrahim Pur Davud in Paris in 1913, shortly after Pur Davud had arrived in Paris to continue his own education, initially in law, but then he changed his mind and became a scholar of Zoroastrianism. And it was really, and Pur Davud himself credits Madame Kama as really the defining figure who changed the direction of his intellectual development. And it was from that meeting in 1913, when Pur Davud was in his mid-20s, that he then set out to seriously study the Avestan and Pahlavi languages that would ultimately lead to his subsequent accomplishments. The second important encounter between Pur Davud and the Parsis that I discuss in the book took place about a decade later in the 1920s. By 1925, Pur Davud had gained some notoriety as the first modern Iranian to have mastered Avestan and Pahlavi. The Parsis in India had for some time been hoping to produce a translation of the Zoroastrian texts for the Iranian marketplace, if you will. And this was part of their larger goal of promoting a new awareness of Zoroastrianism inside Iran. And by 1925, it became clear that Ibrahim Pur Davud was the ideal candidate for this project. And it was the Iran League, again led by Deenshot Irani, who reached out and invited Pur Davud to travel to Bombay, where he spent almost 3 years. And during this time, Pur Davud collaborated closely with Parsi scholars and priests. And it was the result of these collaborations we see the publication of a series of books in Persian, published in Bombay under Parsi auspices, all intended for export to Iran. And the most important of these is undoubtedly Pur Davud's Persian translation of the Gathas, which is translated and now made available in the poetic idiom of the Persian language. And let me just show you very briefly. Here is Pur Davud arriving in India. There's Deenshot Irani there, standing next to him. This is actually Peshon Toji Marker, who was one of the main patrons of the Parsis of India towards Iran. He provided numerous resources for Zoroastrian charities in Iran, or the famous orphanage in Kerman, but he also sponsored many of Pur Davud's published books. There's Pur Davud, another young Pur Davud in the middle here. You can see they're actually standing at the docks in front of a steamship. And this is actually Abdul Hossein Sepanta, who scholars of Iranian film might know. But before he was a filmmaker, he worked for Deenshot Irani as a translator and interpreter. And Deenshot Irani knew Persian, but I think he had more of an academic knowledge of Persian. And I think Sepanta was very useful for him for a lot of the translation and that kind of work. On the right here, this is Bahramgor Anklasaria, another of the famous Parsi scholars of India at this time, whom Pur Davud collaborated with very closely. He also later, I don't say very much about this in the book, but Sadegh Hidayat, when Sadegh Hidayat went to India, it was Anklasaria who was his main teacher in Bombay as well. And here's another, there's Deenshot Irani there again in the middle, really a kind of central figure in this. And here's the picture of the Gathas. This is the cover page of the Gathas. And here's Pur Dawood in the library at, I think, the Kama Institute in Bombay with a picture of his book. Pur Dawood's translation of the Gathas really grew out of this encounter, engagement, encouragement, as well as the material support provided by the Parsi community of Bombay. Now, let me say something about the last chapter of the book, which is about the newspaper Iran-Bastan. And this newspaper, Iran-Bastan, was founded by the journalist and activist Abdul Rahman Saif Azad. And let me give you his picture just to show you as well. Usually I have the slides at the same time. This is actually another image of the Gathas, and you can see it's in parallel text with the Persian on the left, the rest in here. Here's Saif Azad. The chapter goes into some detail about the life and work of Saif Azad, a figure about whom we still really have very little in modern Iranian historiography. And as I argue in the chapter, Saif Azad's life reflects the cultural fluidity and the politically dynamic nature of Iranian nationalism in the interwar period. What little we have written about Saif Azad has usually identified him as the principal propagandist of the Nazi ideology inside Iran during the 1930s, which is certainly true. And what I discovered during the course of the research for the book is that this is a somewhat incomplete accounting of Saif Azad's life. He had, in fact, spent about a dozen years in Weimar, Berlin, where he began his journalistic career. And during that period, he was principally an activist who advocated for independence movements across Asia. And his first journalistic enterprise, which was actually by far his most successful one, was in the successful publication of the multilingual transnational newspaper called Azadi Sharq, which I will show you the masthead for. And here it is. This was a newspaper that combined anti-imperial political language with a vocabulary drawn from Islamism, Bolshevism, nationalism, representing a kind of what I try to call a proto-third worldist ideology that would become maybe much more developed after World War II, but we can already kind of see it in this period. By the early 1930s, Saif Azad was seeking new patrons for his journalism and his activism, and he now reached out to the Parsis of Bombay. And he proposed to Parsi civic leaders the idea of publishing a newspaper in Persian in Tehran that would promote Parsi-Iranian relations. And in fact, let me show you another important image. This image isn't in the book. I couldn't have a good enough quality for it, but here it is. Here is Saif Azad here. You can see him wearing his Pahlavi hat in Bombay with some of the leaders of the Iran League and others. And there's markers again as well. And there are some other figures here. I think this is Khosrow Fitr, who was another important figure in the Iran League. And some of these others are major patrons of the Iran League. That's from the Iran League Quarterly, it was published. So he proposed a newspaper to this group of Parsi civic-minded patrons. And by this period, the Parsis were concerned about their future in India. It was unclear what their prospects would be in a post-independence India as one of the most favored and most prosperous communities in the Raj. And the idea of remigration was actually being discussed among Parsi civic leaders as a serious option, especially since there seemed to be a growing interest among some Iranians regarding their Zoroastrian heritage. And Saif Azad's overture to the Parsis was ultimately accepted. And in 1933, the Iran-Bastan newspaper began publication. Now, the chapter goes into some detail about this newspaper. And here it is. And in short, during the first 9 months of the newspaper's life, the content of the newspaper was very favorable towards the Parsis. It published numerous biographies of prominent Parsi members, many of which were patrons of Saif Azad in this period. And it published articles promoting the idea of a Parsi return to Iran. By the fall of 1933, however, the content of the newspaper changed. And it's from this period that Iran-Bastan becomes the mouthpiece of Nazi propaganda inside Iran. And the Nazi government, the new Nazi government that had come to power also in 1933, had recruited Saif Azad and began using the newspaper for its own purposes. And you can see it very clearly in the Iran-Bastan, and you can see the masthead image changes very dramatically. And articles and stories about the rise of Hitler and the Nazis becomes sort of part of the main content of this journal, which is what the journal is normally known for. But those first 9 months, as I suggest to you, the origins of this newspaper began in a very different way. And as I detail in the chapter, Saif Azad was himself a very kind of wily character, and that's also part of how he's usually remembered. He was opportunistic, and he was willing and able to align or realign the content of the newspaper to the political interests of his new patrons, the Nazis, and especially the foreign ministry of the Nazi government. And in some ways, the break with the Parsis in the Iran-Bastan newspaper is emblematic of a larger tension that is also at work in the Iran-Parsi relationship. And this is another one of the key ideas that I discuss in the book, and I'll try to finish with this. While the growing contact between Parsis and Iranians had helped to build cultural, ideological, social, economic bonds between Parsis and Iranians, the political goals of the two communities were ultimately very different. For the Parsis, it was a liberal, pluralistic, ecumenical goal that had always been central to their desire to reach out to their ancestral homeland. And this was a political outlook that had been forged by the Parsi community's status as a prosperous minority community in British India. Inside Iran, however, the revival of antiquity as a cultural and ideological project was always tied to the multiple political trajectories of Iranian nationalism, which included both a liberal democratic project of Iranian nationalism and a more conservative form of Iranian nationalism that had affinities to fascist politics. And by the mid-1930s, this more conservative right-wing form of Iranian nationalism was ascendant. And ultimately, part of the story that I try to tell in the book is that the Parsis and the Iranians were, in the end, despite all that they shared or thought they shared, were ultimately in some ways unable to really understand each other. And it was the shifting political contexts of Iran and India during the 1930s that prevented a kind of permanent connection, much less a return or remigration to Iran by the Parsis. Maybe that's probably a good place for me to stop. And I will be happy to take your questions. Thank you so much for your attendance and attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marashi, for this really very exhilarating and thought-provoking presentation. Certainly for me, as a student of modern Iranian history, there's so much that one can explore in the themes that you've presented to us, particularly during the 1920s and 30s, since much of what we hear about, or at least in my case, I knew about Iranian, the presence of Zoroastrianism, both indigenous and from Parsis of India, goes back to the 19th century with people like Mullah Firuz and the presentation of Dasatir or other works, or with most important Monarchy, that's Hushan Kataria, that played a very significant part in the greater awareness of the shared heritage of Zoroastrianism in the course of the 19th century, but far less is known about this later period, or what it's known is really very superficial. Nobody has looked at it in greater depth. So your work pretty much, and your presentation today, obviously is very welcome.
Thank you.
In that
Thank you.
regard. However, we have about 11 questions so far.
Okay.
12, it's growing in number, and 13. And it seems that inevitably I have to quickly move on to ask these questions. But before doing so, I mean, at least as my privilege as the moderator of this session, let me ask you about one of the first questions that was actually brought up, is that how far Keykhosrow Shahrukh and the early publications that we've referred to played a part in the constitutional period prior to the rise of the Pahlavis. Mm-hmm. Would you see that, given the fact that the contribution of Zoroastrians and Keykhosrow Shahrukh in particular was quite, Arbab Feridun as well, was very crucial in the earlier period during the Constitutional Revolution. How far you can make a connection with this earlier period?
Yes, that's, I think, very important. And in fact, really one of the primary motives for Shahrukh's writing of these two books was very much in the context of the debates that were happening in the constitutional revolution period. And so he was really trying to make the case for the Zoroastrian community and Zoroastrianism at large as part of the project of the 1905 revolution. And in some ways, you know, that's also part of this tension within this whole movement. On the one hand, there's the project of 1905, which Shahrukh was very much a part of, and which is also what drew a lot of the Parsis to reconnect with Iran in that period as well, including Deenshot Irani. They saw the 1905 project as really part of what they envisioned for a modern Iran. And those two books in particular were very much produced in the context of the debates of the constitutional era. Now, the tensions and the evolution, that evolves later. And it's really, I would say, you know, as I try to suggest, the tension was always there, but it's only in the 1930s that you see this change take place and the politics begin to shift. But for Shahrukh's life and his work, it was very much part of the earlier project of 1905.
Thank you so much. I think we can move on to a number of other questions that we had. Mrs. Tarushian asked that, first of all, almost unanimously across all the comments and questions that we have there, thanking you for the production of this book and thanking you for the presentation as well. But the question that comes here, the second one, is that how important was, or whether there was any connection between the Parsi productions of Persian cinema in Bombay, with Mr. Sepanta, of course, that we've mentioned. Do you see that there is some interaction here, the use of the Persian particularly as a vernacular in these films? Perhaps also Fabod would like to add something to that later on. But let's first hear from you.
Well, I can try to say something about that. Actually, the history of film and the role of the Parsis in the film industry, including in, you know, the first Persian language talkie film, as we say, were very intimately involved in the film industry in that case, in that context. Although that's something I don't say very much about in the book. And at some point I made a choice of, you know, what am I going to talk about and what am I not going to talk about. My original intention was to have a discussion of the Parsi role in the early Iranian film industry. Certainly Hamid Nafisi has done a good job of that. Mm-hmm. And Laura Fish wrote an article about that a couple of years ago. And I hope to see more about that. But in this book, Sepenta makes an appearance, but he's really more of a scribe in this context rather than a filmmaker. But certainly, I think promoting the Persian language and their role in the first talkie is a very important part of their role as well.
Thank you, Fabo. Do you have something to add? I think you should unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you so much for the wonderful and very inspiring talk. Of course, there is the figure of Abdul Hossein Sepenta, who is the first talkie filmmaker from Iran. And he originally went to India in order to study ancient Iranian languages with the scholars there. And then he got to know the figure of Ardeshir Irani. Ardeshir Irani is a very paramount figure in Indian cinema. Not only in some ways he allowed and made it possible for Sepenta to make his films, but he is referred to as the father of Indian talkies. So in a sense, he is a very major figure in Indian cinema also. And he was born into a family of recent immigrants in Iran, from Iran, actually. Mm-hmm. And that continued, the Parsi presence in Indian cinema continues to this day. But what is relevant to your talk, perhaps, is the fact that all of Ardeshir Irani's films and Sepenta's films have a nationalist component to them, yes. Nationalist and modernist.
Yes, that's true. And it's actually interesting, the Irani name refers to a community of people. It's a family name, and you mentioned one Irani, of course, Deenshot Irani and Ardeshir Irani. These are part of the Irani community in Bombay and Western India at this time, who were basically recent Iranian migrants to India. There was the Parsis, which have a history that goes back, a millennium. But during the 19th century, you see a new wave of migration from Iran to India by Zoroastrians. And this new community of migrants become known collectively as the Iranis. And they play a very important role as intermediaries because they are more recently arrived in Bombay and have more of a connection to to Iran. So that's sort of one of the other important themes is this distinct Irani community of Zoroastrians in Bombay and how they played a very important role in history and culture, but also in film.
Thank you so much. If we would quickly move on, because the number of questions keep increasing, so we have to attend some of that. We had a comment question from Dr. Cameron Amin to the effect that to what extent the period of greater awareness of Persian as a language, the episode that is known as Bazgasht Adabi, particularly in the 19th century, seem to have impacted by this interaction. If I read that passage, not to mutilate his question, part of Bahar's, that is Malik al-Shu'ara Bahar's, defense of classical poetry in the 1920s, I presume in Afshin, his famous work, was its alleged value of quote unquote moral education for a revival national context. But it also took the Bazgasht Adabi, the episode that I just mentioned, as a point of departure, and in its hostility towards the Sabk Hindi of the Safavid period. Did classical Persian poetry, literature, play a role in the Parsi, quote unquote, national identity in the Indian context in a similar way in the 19th, 20th centuries? Are Parsis seen as not nearly Indian, quote unquote, by Iranian intellectuals who are influenced by Parsi contacts and culture in formalizing their own, and formulating, I'm sorry, their own views of a revival, pure Iranian nation? That's a question. Does any of this feeds pan-Iranianist thinking? So that's the.
There's a lot. That's good.
There's a lot to unpack.
Thank you, Kamran. Well, there's a lot there, and I mean, I can't address all of that, and I can try my best to answer some of it. But what I discovered in the course of doing the research for this, and again, Deenshot Irani is a very interesting character for a number of reasons. And one of the things that he produced, one of the books that I actually didn't include in this discussion, was an anthology of Persian poetry that was produced during the Pahlavi period, or since, I think he basically describes it as a supplement to E.G. Brown's volume of Persian literature, everything published since the publication of E.G. Brown's History of Persian Literature. And what I took away from Deenshot Irani's anthology is sort of almost like a tazkere, a modern 20th century one, is that he was one of the few Indians who actually was open to and liked the idea of sort of Iranian Persian as the real Persian. So in a sense, it makes sense. As the Parsis came to see themselves as a diaspora community separated from their original homeland, it was the language of Persian that actually became the form of literature that they valued. And so they were maybe the only Indians that agreed with Bahar that the Sabka Hindi was, a problem. I don't know if that's true, but you see that in Deenshot Irani sort of valuing the Persian poetry of Iran more than the other literary traditions. So that fits into the political context of the nationalism as well, I think, of how they saw themselves.
Well, if I just quickly add one comment to that, one would be amazed to see that even in the early part of the 19th century, perhaps late 18th century, as early as that, as late 18th century, you see among many of the Parsis revival of Persian, which in certain respect is a Persian which is not as Arabicized. I use this term very loosely. I mean, the kind of an Arab Persian that was accustomed in the Timurid period, perhaps even the Safavid period, and was changed in the Qajar period, as was pointed out by Dr. Cameron. I was amazed to see, struck by the richness of that language. I mean, if you look at Mullah Firuz's, the infamous George-Nameh that he produced in the style of Shahnameh is quite amazing. Mm-hmm. I mean, his literary command of the language is amazing. I mean, the content aside, but what you would see that he would be able to produce perhaps as good, or in certain respects, purely in the stylistic respect, better than Fath Ali Khan Saba's Shahnshah-Nameh. So one should give them that credit, that already that had this kind of a sense of a revival of Persian, and that then was
definitely Deenshot Irani talks about the purity of Persian in that sense as well. Yeah.
Yes, great. All right, then let us move on. There's a question by one of our PhD candidates here, Avi Nouri, who asks a question about classical Greek and in Western context and how much it corresponds to the revival of interest in ancient past. And she asked the question, there has been a growing interest in Zoroastrianism inside Iran, sometimes at the expense of Islam. Given that out of 160 and something Darul Mehrs in the world today, 150 are in India. Do you believe in Zoroastrianism return to Iran? It'll be the Indian version complete with some Indian customs and norms and that were not originally part of Zoroastrianism? Well, that question maybe not necessarily within the bounds of your book, but if you have any comments to make on that.
It's hard for me to say about that, although there was certainly, in the context of what I do discuss in the book, when Parsis traveled to Iran, a lot of the things that they discovered was the different kinds of practices of Zoroastrianism inside Iran compared to practices of Zoroastrianism in India. And that became a kind of question that they debated. And certainly in the question that is, as it's being posed now, looking in the future, it's the same question, is which is the true authentic form of Zoroastrianism, which is the better form of Zoroastrianism. And in the period that I focus on, the Parsis are very clear that their mission is to correct the incorrect Zoroastrian practices that are happening inside Iran, because there was a kind of maybe accretions and syncretism that had developed over time. And the Parsis of India felt that their form, their reformed, modernized form, was the original true form. So I think I can't project the future, and it is outside of kind of what I'm thinking is even plausible, but I think it'll be the same question that will be debated if that ever happens.
Of course, the reverse of it was also true, as I'm sure you recognize that the earlier on, it was emphasis that the Zoroastrianism practiced in Iran was the more authentic one.
Exactly. And Monica Ringer talks about that, and that's one of the things that changed. Which community has the authority? Yes. Is it the Iranian Zoroastrians or the Indian Zoroastrians? And probably right down till today, probably the Indian Zoroastrians are the more authoritative. So that's probably another way to answer the question. Yeah.
Thank you very much. As you can see on your screen, that is Dr. Marashi. The anonymous attendee asked a question: what was the relationship with the Aga Khan and the Ismaili community in India? That's a remarkable question, because these are two Iranian-based, barely Iranian communities in India.
That's a very good question. And one of the things that I sort of discovered I can't answer with much detail, but I think certainly the history of Ismailism in India is another topic very worthy of research.
Probably the next book, isn't it?
Not mine, but I'd be happy to talk to some aspiring PhD students. But I think that the history of Ismailism is another very interesting parallel with the history of the Parsis. And as far as I know, we don't have much on modern Ismaili history in India, which I think would be a very good topic to do. But I think there would be some connections. And I think actually I have seen some of the newspaper accounts, and even in the Iranli Quarterly, there are some references to the Aga Khan, but I can't say any more than that.
Yes, there are a few publications on more recent or contemporary Ismaili publication, Ismaili research or theological texts of the Iranians in India, but none of them really pays attention to the historical perspective,
right,
as I can say.
Yeah, I think
these are the publications of the Ismaili Institute in London.
I think that's generally true. We have, we focus a lot on the theological questions, but the social and historical context, I think that's part of what I'm trying to do.
Thank you. Dr. Koka asked a question about I'm just trying to figure out what exactly, how can I summarize the question? I have taught myself Avestan over 5 months. So it's more of a personal question. I don't know, concepts and principles of Zoroastrianism. He asked whether this can be interpreted or translated. I think, again, it falls outside the bounds of your research, but would you like to comment on it?
I mean, I'm only seeing something about, is there an online version? And yes, there is an online version of Pur Dawood's translation, if that's what this person is asking. But there's many available online editions.
Which incidentally, that translation later on, as I'm sure many in the audience and yourself, Dr. Marashi, are very well aware, was questioned. Right. That some of these translations of the terms, Avestan text being complex enough, the translations made them somewhat more complex. Then if we move on to Dr. Sam Hodgkin,
Oh yeah,
colleague here,
sure.
who asks, there's a moment in your book that I'd like to invite you to talk more about. In your rich discussion of the process of which Parsis came to think of themselves as exiles, there is a moment where Saif Azad compares this cultural project to Zionism. Obviously, the relationship is a vexed one, given Parsi's interest in the Aryan race theory, Nazism, etc., but purely in terms of the comparative dimension of your project, could you share your thoughts on how the early 20th century Parsi, Iranian, and Zionist projects, both shading into nationalism, but not reducible to it, compare to each other? Are there exilic nationalist movements that you find especially useful points of comparison? I think it's a very
good question.
Very complex, very rich question. So please go ahead.
Well, I mean, it's an excellent question, and it's definitely something that I've thought about and I discuss in the book. It pops up here and there in the book, as Samuel Hodgkin mentioned. And it's one of the reasons why I use the term negation of exile, because of course that's a term that comes out of Jewish history as well, and the history of Zionism. And I think there is very much a comparison between the two. I mean, one of these, the historic diaspora communities, of course, there's the Jewish diaspora and there's the Parsi diaspora. But of course there's others too, the Irish diaspora, Armenian diaspora. You can think of, I've been thinking more about the movement of, Marcus Garvey in America, and, the African diaspora in the Americas, and the travel back to, to Africa in that period, also in the same period. So I think there is a great deal of comparison to be made. And certainly, and in terms of, are the politics similar or different? Well, I don't know. I mean, ultimately, certainly the Zionist project is probably the most successful by terms of negating exile and recreating the homeland, the nation state as it existed in some remote past. In the case of the Parsi, it's a little bit different, because there was an Iranian state that was actually assisting them and encouraging them. In fact, the government of Reza Shah was really actively encouraging Parsis to return. And if anything, and I talk about this in the book, the ultimate story, I mentioned it briefly in the talk, ultimately, the difference between maybe the Zionist project and the Parsi project is ultimately the Parsis didn't go home. The Parsis did not return to Iran. And that also is born as a result of, the politics of the 1930s. And ultimately, when World War II began, it put an end to all of the, the hopes and aspirations of any possible return. So during the 1930s, there was discussion of it, but there was always an ambivalence among the Parsis about the desire to actually return to the homeland. There were some people encouraging it, including Saif Azad and many Parsis themselves. But maybe the difference between the Zionist project and the Parsi project is that the Parsis were more interested than finally, in fact, taking the steps to implement this idea.
Thank you so much. A question was asked by Mr. Jabbari, Alexander Jabbari, who points out that at some, in your talk, you mentioned something about the reception of Darwinism. Yes. Whether this had any impact on the scientific theories in general on the reform of Zoroastrianism.
Okay, another great topic, and it's something that I think there's a lot more room for discussion in this research. Darwinism was part of it, and I mentioned Newtonian physics. A lot of these ideas were filtered in through the Theosophical Society, and the encounter between the Parsi Community of India and the ideas of the Theosophical Society channeled a lot of these scientific ideas. And in the Victorian era, Zoroastrianism was seen as sort of, there were many debates in Victorian England about Darwinism and its relationship to religion, and as though religion would be refuted by the scientific discoveries of Darwinism. But there were many European science writers and scholars who said that in Zoroastrianism, that conflict between religion and science didn't exist. And they looked into Zoroastrianism to find things that would confirm scientific discoveries. And Darwinism was one thing that they found, Newtonian physics was one thing that they found, even something like the discoveries of, and this is what I do discuss in the book, the idea of the polarity in Zoroastrianism of, good and evil, that sort of dualism in Zoroastrianism was interpreted by some popular scientific writers in the Victorian period as confirming the theory of electromagnetism and magnets. And so this was seen as demonstrating that Zoroastrianism was a modern religion that could be at home in the world of science. And there's a lot of writing in Victorian literature about this, and I've only drawn on some of that appears ultimately in these Persian language books.
Thank you so much. Again, I think there was another question to the same effect, which I presume you have just answered, by Marion Ericlio. I hope I'm not mutilating the name, about the scientific point that we have raised, Zoroastrianism as a scientific religion, which I think you have answered to that. For the interest of the time, let us move on to a question by Professor Kevin von Bladel here in our Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, who asks, thanks you, and asks, you mentioned several scholars involved in the exchange between Iranian and Parsi scholars and wealthy patrons. You ended with Saif Azad and his Iran-Bastan. Which of the figures you mentioned continued to affiliate themselves with Saif Azad and his journal and his politics?
Okay, so this is another very good question. And I think, I definitely don't want to be the last word on Saif Azad, because I think in some ways he remains a mystery and there's more to say about him. But it's very clear that, he had a break with the Parsis sometime around 1935, although he didn't have a final break with all Parsis, and there were different views within the Parsi community as well. Saif Azad does return to India in 1936 or 7, I believe, and he did have contacts with some members of the Parsi community. And in the book, I think it only makes it into a footnote, but there were figures within the Parsi community that maintained their relationship with Saif Azad even after, the Iran-Bastan turned its editorial policy. So that is part of the mystery that I think might still require some unraveling. But the journal ended somewhat abruptly. It might require some more digging on that.
May I just interject one word? I believe it must have been Khosrow Shahrukh's son, Bahram Shahrukh, who was the chief person in the Radio Berlin's Persian program during the war.
Yes.
Do you have any comments on that? Was this also something that was backed by certain factors? Just as a compliment to the questions by Kevin.
Yeah, I discussed Bahram Shahrukh in the book. And in fact, that is, he ultimately became, the main propagandist for the Nazi radio from Berlin, Radio Berlin. And so that it created a family conflict between Khosrow and his son, Bahman. And ultimately, that conflict, probably some people say, and this is an issue I discuss in the book, may very well have led to the death of Khosrow Shahrukh, and the idea that he may have been assassinated because of the political machinations of the of having, an Iranian supporting the Nazis from Berlin. So that is definitely a way that I use in the book to discuss the tension within Khosrow Shahrukh's life as well, between his project and what his son ultimately transforms it. Very similar to what happens with Iran-Bastan. So there's a tension between these two different forms of Iranian nationalism. And that's kind of one of the arguments I'm really trying to make, is to argue that, when we say Iranian nationalism, it's not one thing. And it evolved, and it has many different forms and shapes. And sort of trying to retrieve some of these other forms is part of what I've been trying to do here.
Thank you so much. There's a question by Catherine Foley about theosophists and theosophical connection, which you have referred to as a fascinating concept. But bear in mind that it's the same time that Baha'is also pay attention to theosophists in Europe during Abdul Baha's tour of Europe. That's a
Yeah, I mean, I'll say a little bit more about that. I think, the Theosophical Society was very well developed in India as well as in Europe and in North America. And a lot of these universalist ideas that entered into the Parsi interpretation of Zoroastrianism, it's a question: where did these ideas come from? One way of arguing or explaining its origin is to trace it back to a kind of an early modern Persianate cosmopolitan sense of universalism. And I think that's part of what I try to make that argument too, is that in some ways the Parsis were connected to an earlier heritage of Persianate universalism that allowed for these universalist ideas to develop in their modern form. However, the other, I think, modern channel by which these more ecumenical universalist ideas entered into this Parsi reform movement may very well have been through the Theosophical Society. So I think it's sort of the coming together of both of those things that helped to shape a lot of these more pluralistic, religiously ecumenical ideas that were developing within a particularly Parsi reading of Zoroastrianism. But I think that's an important point.
Thank you so much. We are at the end of our time, but I just wonder if Dr. Marashi still has the stamina to answer more questions. And
sure.
Whether, Marwa, would you allow us to go on for another 15 minutes? Well, since we heard nothing here.
It's fine with me. I'll do my best.
Okay. All right, then. There is a question for Dr. O'Malley, Austin O'Malley, who asks that Parsi community of co-religionists should be helped through philanthropy. Is this tied to European sponsoring of various Christian sects in the Middle East and India? Mm-hmm. Or are these genealogical for this that can be considered? I mean, I hope I'm not...
I think I understand. I think that's another good point. And along with the Theosophical Society, the other really important model that influenced the Parsi thinking about Zoroastrianism and the relationship to Iran was the Christian missions in India, which were also very active. And so much of what the Parsis were doing in Iran were modeled after missionary work. I mean, in some cases, you might say even, Menakji Limji is sometimes called a Zoroastrian missionary to Iran. And you could probably say the same thing with some of the work of the Iran League, even publishing, the book industry, the publishing industry. And as I mentioned, a lot of these books that were being produced and exported by Parsis in Bombay were in the form of pamphlets, or very often in the form of, the kinds of missionary tracts that would circulate. These weren't, as I mentioned in the talk, these weren't, grand treatises on Zoroastrianism. These were short, brief pamphlets, introductory texts that were meant for distribution and circulation, very often for free. And so I think that's very much modeled on a missionary project of producing texts that can then circulate into Iran. In addition to, of course, education and hospitals, which were also part of missionary work in India that became a model for this. So I think the connection between the Parsis and their work and the model of Christian missions in India is a very important one too. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. I think we have a question along the same lines again here. We see that a question by one of our postgraduate fellows at Yale, Kevin Gledhill in History Department, asks, I'm curious about the relationship between these Iranian Parsi contacts and the issues of declining Persianate system mentioned early in the talk. Do you think that these contacts as a type of reconstituted Persianate in introducing antiquity as a means of sustaining this system where language, Islam, adab, literary forms, etc., had functioned to connect it in the past or to the past? What might we conclude about a sort of quote unquote late Persianate form of this research?
I think that's interesting. Yeah, and I think we should definitely have a discussion of the Persianate in all of its complexities. And one way of doing that might well be to sort of further differentiate the periodization. And I think the idea of a late Persianate concept might be a useful way of thinking about, at least in part, how the Parsis fit into this story. In some ways, what I described as the decline of the Persianate, it sort of is part of this idea in which there were many different cultural strands that were being sort of posed during the age of nationalism. And as the nation state became a new model for configuring culture and politics, it was a lot of the different strands out of the declining Persianate system that were mobilized for new nationalist projects. And certainly the Parsi one is one. Although the Parsi project, as I also suggest, was very much, in some ways, it reified Iran as a territorial space, certainly. And in that ways, it was very modern, a modern nation state model. But in another sense, the Parsis really did draw on an earlier Persianate ecumenism in this sort of cosmopolitan idea of the Persianate was very much part of their interpretation of Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism, and I discussed this in the book, and when I was reading, Deenshot Irani's pamphlets, for example, and Keykhosrow Shahrok's pamphlets, these aren't sort of anti-Islamic tracts. These are texts that see in Zoroastrianism as a coeval religious tradition with Islam that coexists with Islam in a way that a kind of earlier Persianate syncretism may very well have existed. And Deenshot Irani's writings are very clear on this. And this is, of course, an idea that goes back to earlier traditions that people have written about, going back to Henri Corbin and these kinds of figures that have seen in Zoroastrianism as a kind of a multivocal religious tradition that connects and overlaps with Islam. The Parsis really drew on that. And I think that comes out of a Persianate heritage. What happened in Iran, I think, is something more complicated. But I think from the Parsis, it was, this earlier Persianate heritage was very important, even though they were still now beginning to think within the framework of a modern nation state, which might be one way of thinking about the late Persianate period.
Thank you so much. I think we are really exhausting you, but the questions that comes are so interesting, and we have quite a lot of them. Kehan Nejad is a PhD candidate in the history department, asks, who works on the same time period, on a different topic though. He asks, in addition to political tensions between liberal and fascist leaning conceptions of nationalism, to what extent did the Parsis fear of losing their very privileged economic status in India doomed the remigration movements in the 1930s?
Yes, that's a very good question. And that's a very important one. And it definitely comes up a lot in the sources. In some ways, it's very clear in the discussions that are, you see it very clearly in the Iranli Quarterly, where a lot of these discussions within the Parsis about their future in India takes place, that they have a lot of concerns. They have concerns about their future in India, but they also have concerns about what a potential future in Iran might consist of. And ultimately, one of the reasons why they didn't make the move to Iran, or not very many of them did, was because they felt ultimately that going to Iran might not be such a good, have good prospects for them, because the situation there might evolve in ways that were unforeseen. Some had very utopian ideas about what the future of Iran would look like from a Parsi perspective in the 1930s. Others were much more cautious. And among the things that they were also already very aware of was, this is the beginning of the Cold War as well, even before World War II. And the possibility of what the Russians might do in Iran was already looming for Parsis. And going to Iran, and then what if Iran becomes communist? That would doom their economic prospects by going to Iran. And there were other caution things that they were worried about, including being a religious minority community, and how that would, what position they would have within the economic and political system and the legal system of guaranteeing their economic privileges. So whether they were staying in India had its problem, but going to Iran also would pose its own challenges. And so they were kind of unclear about what to do.
A question with Dr. Talin Gregor, asking a tension that has been explored in your book, Parsi liberal reforms and the Iranian right-wing nationalism. Could you speak of an overlap of the Parsi form of xenophobia that sustained them as an exilic diaspora, and an Iranian brand of nationalist agenda that eventually clashes with each other? That's also a very interesting question.
It is. It is. Ultimately, I mean, this is part of why one of the conclusions that I try to make is that ultimately, even though the Parsis and the Iranians were talking to each other and they seemed to think they had a lot in common, ultimately the politics was very different. And among the, there's obviously there's different groups within the Parsi community, and some are also more conservative, and just as within Iranian nationalism. So I think in some ways, they're both equivalent in that way. You'll see the same tension within both communities, and within the diaspora then as now, I think you'll still see the same kind of range of possibilities.
Thank you. There is a question, there is a comment by Dr. Ringer thanking you for the wonderful talk. There is also one about the relations with the Iranian state, which seems that we have answered to some extent under the Reza Shah period. Dr. Nahid Siamdost, whom I should thank again, although it was mentioned by Farbod, that was responsible for your invitation last term, which did not work out. We would welcome her question here. It says, did the association with the Nazis and the occupation of the Allies during World War II basically dent the relationship between Parsis and the Iranian Zoroastrians, or Iran at large? Mm-hmm. Could you speak of what happened to this relationship from the 30s and 40s onwards, mm-hmm. and possibly to the current period?
That's another very good question. And it's not something I've looked at very closely, but I might say anecdotally, after World War II, the relationship didn't end. It continued, not in the same way as it existed before. But by the time we get to the 1960s and 70s, of course, the culture of, the Pahlavi monarchy in that period was very much interested in a revival of antiquity, maybe even more so than it had ever been under Reza Shah. And in that period, you also see a traffic between Parsis and Iranians in the 1960s and 70s. Parsis never, remigrate back to Iran, but in the 1960s and 70s, they start to travel to Iran on a large scale. And that actually begins in the 1930s, is Parsi tourism, of traveling to Iran to see Iran and see the archaeological sites. That begins in the 1930s. In the 1940s and 50s, I don't think there's much of it, just because of maybe the political context was different. But in the 1960s and 70s, there is a new era of Parsi connection and travel and tourism to Iran. So it didn't dent the relationship permanently. Since the revolution, I can't say. Since 1979, I think things are probably different, and I don't think there's as much Parsis traveling to Iran today.
Thank you very much. I think we are really at the end of our time. Perhaps the last question, I apologize to those who have raised more questions and we haven't been able to respond. Dr. Shayeste, who teaches Persian language for us here, asked the questions, did anyone notice the decline in the Parsi population at the time? Or is that only a more recently noticed phenomenon?
I think it was always a concern, even back in this period. It's certainly a very grave concern now. In the 19th century, the decline of the Iranian Zoroastrian population was certainly much more discussed among both Parsis and Iranian Zoroastrians. And the accounts that we have were of a very impoverished and declining community during the 19th century, which was part of what really sparked the age of Parsi philanthropy towards the Zoroastrian Iranians. Among the Parsi community itself, I think it was always a concern, but it's certainly much more of a concern in the last number of decades. But even in the early 20th century, I think the Parsis, even though they were socially, commercially, economically thriving, it was always a microscopic community on the verge of maintaining itself.
Dr. Marashi, thank you so much for this extremely interesting, exhilarating, I'm not exaggerating, it's one of the best sessions that we've had, certainly due to the topic that you've dealt with, your presentation, and perhaps the magic of Zoom connections that allows us to get so many questions from people from all over. We had as many as 101 participants in our Zoom session, and we are delighted to hear that. Thank you, everybody who attended, and we very, very much hope you would attend other sessions that are all posted on the website of the Yale program in Iranian Studies. If you can take a look, in addition to the special session that I pointed out, it's going to be on the 28th of October. The details are in the poster on the website. And my thanks also, as I was reminded by Fahbod, is to the Council on Middle East Studies that was enabling the entire program of Iranian Studies. With that, I would like to say farewell to everyone and looking forward to see you in future sessions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.